Hello, everyone. My name is Marcus Stanley. I'm the research director of the Quincy Institute. The Quincy Institute is a transpartisan foreign policy think tank in Washington, D.C. And through our research, writing, and advocacy, we promote ideas that move U.S. foreign policy and national security policy away from global domination and militarism and toward a strategy of diplomatic engagement and the defense of our genuine national interests. Today, I am honored to welcome two distinguished scholars, Andrew Preston of, I believe you're Cambridge University right now, but you're about to become the University of Virginia. Uh,
That's right.
if you see that Professor Preston's shelves are a little bare behind him, that's because his books are already en route to the United States, where he will be joining us uh, to become professor at the University of Virginia. And we are here to discuss his new book, Total Defense, The New Deal and the Invention of National Security, which examines the origins of the doctrine of national security in the 1930s and the New Deal and World War II period. And discussing this book and his own work with Dr. Preston will be Stephen Wertheim, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace. And he is the author of a book, Tomorrow the World, the Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy, which is another very important study of the origins of the national security state in the World War II period. So thank you, Dr. Preston and Dr. Wertheim. So just to introduce these books a little bit, the title of the last chapter of Andrew's book is called Security Nation, and that really kind of struck a chord for me because if you live in Washington, D.C., uh, you do foreign policy, but increasingly also if you do domestic policy, you do immigration policy, you do economic policy. The concept of national security is omnipresent, and it is used to justify a vast scope of U.S. government activity, including a military establishment that is headed toward costing $1 trillion a year. I think with the passage of the big beautiful bill, so-called, we are at that level of $1 trillion a year in national security spending. And even beyond direct military spending, so many other interventions that the government undertakes all over the world and far beyond just the defense of the borders of the United States. Um, so really what both Andrew's book and Stephen's book are about is the historical origins of this extremely broad conception of national security, which is still so important for us today, and how those origins in World War II continue to really structure how U.S. government works today. So, Andrew, you early in your book, you say that this book gives a history of the way American national defense was elasticized away from just the defense of our national territory and our national borders to this much broader conception of national security that we have today. Can you tell us something about why you believe that happened and the key moments in that history from your book?
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. And thanks for having me here. I've been following the Quincy Institute's activities since it was founded. It's a very important venue for thinking about American foreign policy and the international system. So it's a real honor to be here to talk about my book. So national security as a way of thinking, as a way of Americans thinking about their place in the world, and especially in thinking about what constitutes a threat to the United States, has has elasticized. I've argued that, other people have argued that, that it has just kept expanding and expanding and expanding. When I started thinking about national security and what national security means for how Americans think about their place in the world, and I started reading the few historians who have talked about and theorized national security as a concept, as opposed to specific national security policies. As opposed, I'm not just talking about specific policies like the World Wars or the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Vietnam War, although I do look into those specific policies. When I started reading about just the basic way in which Americans think about threat in the world and the history of that, I noticed that most historians thought of it as timeless. And they would talk about George Washington's national security policies or Alexander Hamilton's national security policies and so on and so forth. And the more reading I did, that struck me as ahistorical, and that national security as a concept must have a history of its own. I wasn't the first to ask this question. There's a small handful of historians who have historicized national security. Most of them date the origins of national security as a concept to the early Cold War. And if they have to pick a sort of origin moment, it would be 1947 and the National Security Act. And there's an even smaller group of historians, and Stephen I would put in this group. I don't know if he'd put himself in this group, but I would put him there. But a very small group of historians who say it wasn't the sort of expansion of American self-defense and the expansion, the invention of national security isn't a product of the early Cold War, but it's a product of the late 1930s and early 1940s. And I very much, the more reading I did, the more research I did, I very much agreed with that historicization, that sort of origin story, and putting it in the late 1930s and early 1940s. My book argues that before then, Americans conceived of self-defense in much narrower terms than they do today. They conceived of self-defense as the defense of physical attacks against American territorial sovereignty. That's the traditional definition of self-defense going back for centuries. That is still how self-defense is codified in international law. And that changed when we move into the early 20th century. And it changed gradually. It started to change in the World War I era, but I call that era a sort of an era of false starts, where Woodrow Wilson moved towards what would later become national security, but stopped short. And so in World War I, for instance, he never justified American intervention against the Germans as a way of protecting the United States, as a way of defending the United States. He made all sorts of arguments for intervention based on what was good for the world, and creating a new liberal order and making the world safe for democracy, and so on and so forth. But he never said America was under threat or was at risk directly from a foreign adversary. So he made gestures towards this, but he stopped short. And really, I say, what the book does is it explores in some great detail as to why it was the 1930s, why it was Franklin Roosevelt who invented the concept of national security. A big part of that story is about an increasingly interconnected, interdependent world where military threats could emanate from, distant reaches of the planet and affect the United States eventually. But what I really develop in the book is the argument that national security is the flip side of the coin to social security, and that it emerged in the 1930s not only because of interdependence and global military threats and the Nazis and the Japanese and that sort of thing, but that it emerged as an aspect of New Deal liberalism, because what the New Deal did was reconceive of the social contract between the American government and the American people. And initially, it was about tackling the Depression and providing for socioeconomic security. And it was the Roosevelt administration telling the American people, with the New Deal, we will protect you. We will protect you against immediate threats that are affecting you right now, but we'll also protect you against remote and distant threats that may not be affecting you right now, but that have a plausible chance that they will affect you. And when the world crisis heated up in the late 1930s, he took that thinking of providing for a basic measure of security for the American people. The government has an obligation to provide for you, to provide for your security. He took that thinking, that basic concept, from tackling the Depression to addressing the world crisis. And that's really where my book makes its contribution. So it's not the early Cold War where national security is born. It's the late 30s, early 40s. It's an aspect of the New Deal. It's an aspect of liberalism. And what the Cold War does is that it really sets it in place. It kind of crystallizes it. So 1947 to me isn't the beginning point, it's the end point. That's when everything falls into place. And even when Americans differ or disagree or argue about specific national security policies, the basic matrix of how Americans identify threat then crystallizes in 47 and has remained unchanged more or less until very recently. And it's only very recently where things are starting to destabilize with that national security way of seeing the world and way of reacting to the world.
Thank you. So I should mention we're getting a couple of questions in already, and we are going to make sure to get to all of those questions. I think some in the middle of the talk and then some toward the end. I'm going to take moderator privilege here and ask a couple of questions myself to start with. One sort of almost footnote type question to what you just said. Um, you do place the origins of national security thinking in fundamentally this progressive vision of economic planning and social security and so on. But then, of course, in the Cold War, national security very much becomes about anti-communism, and in fact, the national security state kind of attacks. Um, Henry Wallace very much comes from that very progressive um, kind of domestic policy tradition, but he's against the Cold War, is attacked by anti-communists, and very quickly, national security becomes this very conservative kind of force. Can you say something about that or that transition a little?
Well, in the Cold War, I don't think it became just a conservative force because liberals were, of course, fiercely anti-communist themselves. And I think that doesn't really change until the 60s, until Vietnam, where conservatives become much more pro-national security and liberals become much kind of disaffected, or a lot of liberals become disaffected with national security. But you're absolutely right. The one of the contributions I think that the book makes is to situate the origins of national security not within reactionary anti-communism or conservatism or some other illiberal um, ideology or trend in American political culture, but within liberalism and within New Deal liberalism. And so one of the questions that I had when I began the book, it wasn't a question that drove me to write the book, but it was a question I'd always had, is that why were the major war presidents of the 20th century, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Lyndon Johnson, why were they all not just Democrats, but liberal Democrats with a big progressive domestic agenda?
Hmm.
And so once I started seeing national security as not just a reaction to the Germans and the Japanese, was it's a reaction to the Germans and the Japanese, but it's a reaction that is conditioned by Roosevelt's own liberalism and his particular type of New Deal liberalism to provide for the security of citizens. Then that started to make sense because Wilson started to make that argument in World War I, and then for a variety of reasons I explain in the book, it then died an early death. FDR then really cements it. Truman picks it up. LBJ picks it up. And then with the failure in Vietnam, then that scrambles everything, and liberals and conservatives start to go their separate ways. But this vision of national security that FDR set up for the Germans and the Japanese, the irony that you're hinting at, Marcus, is that he sort of sets it up to deal with the Nazis and Japanese. That helps win the war. And then after the war, in the Cold War, Truman takes the exact same vision of national security and applies it to the Soviets and to Soviet communism and later to the Chinese, even though FDR thought that the only way that there was going to be world peace once the Germans and Japanese are defeated is if the US and the USSR get along. I mean, that's the whole point of the UN, is to bring these two emerging superpowers together, and only by cooperating are they going to prevent World War III. But Truman sort of puts that to one side and then uses it as the basis for containment.
Right. Well, we didn't get along, and I guess Roosevelt was right that there wasn't world peace. Um, so a couple of I'm going to drop in a couple of these questions now. A couple of them I think we'll save for later. One viewer asked if you were influenced by Gabriel Kolko in your work.
So Kolko, not so much. Kolko is a great historian, and this is not a criticism of Kolko, but he wasn't a sort of lodestar for me when I was writing this particular book. Now, he does, and a lot of other historians from the New Left tradition. Well, Kolko's writing before the New Left, but they come out of that tradition, pay attention to a lot of attention, obviously, to political economy, and I do as well. But I do so in a different way. I'm less concerned with capitalism and trade and markets, and maybe that's a flaw in the book. Maybe I'm missing something. But what I was trying to do is those questions I think have been addressed really well by that literature, by Kolko and Lefebvre and McCormick and Gardner, and then their descendants. What I was trying to do is take a different approach to political economy. Not for the sake of taking a different approach, but as I did my research, as I started trying to answer the questions that I came up with, it led me into a sort of down a different road to thinking about political economy. So no, Kolko wasn't he wasn't one of the guiding lights for this book.
And another question addressing something I know you did talk about quite a bit in the book, um, whether the Monroe Doctrine, and by the way, the Quincy Institute is named after John Quincy Adams, who you call in your book the most brilliant diplomatic thinker of the 19th century, at least. Um, but you see the Monroe Doctrine as related to kind of this territorial defense that is limited to the Western Hemisphere. But how do you see the Monroe Doctrine as fitting into this?
Well, Marcus, you sort of started answering the question. It's exactly along those lines. The Monroe Doctrine um, separates the world into two. It divides the world into two, and it preserves for the Western Hemisphere under American domination, U.S. domination, that is. Um, it separates the two hemispheres. It preserves for the Western Hemisphere. I don't want to say a kind of purity because that implies isolation, which of course the United States was never isolated. Stephen's book, lots of scholars have picked away at the sort of isolationist myth, but Stephen's book sort of completely levels it. But it did try and separate the two hemispheres in a way that would protect the United States from what was going on in the rest of the world. And what I see as FDR's national security revolution, because I do see it as revolutionary, is kind of breaking down those that sense that the world can be separated into spheres of influence or into a place where a great power cannot go because it's been hived off from the rest of the world by another superpower. The world is fundamentally, this is what FDR said, the world is fundamentally open. There is not really any stopping that openness. He bases a lot of the national security revolution on a sense of the open door, which he didn't come up with. That's a product of the late 19th, early 20th century. But that idea of an open door is very much embedded in the American worldview. In 1940, Franklin Roosevelt, in telling the American people why they had to care what was going on in Europe and Asia, he says famously at my new institution at the University of Virginia at the commencement address, he says the United States cannot remain a lone island in a world dominated by the philosophy of force. And what strikes me about that is that that kind of turns the Monroe Doctrine and much of what came between the Monroe Doctrine and the 1930s completely turns it on its head because previous generations, previous to FDR, previous generations of American officials relished being a lone island of democracy in a world ruled by emperors and kings and so on and so forth. And so I don't really see a continuum from the Monroe Doctrine to Franklin Roosevelt. I see a lot of discontinuity and disjuncture.
And I'm going to turn to Stephen in a second, but one more question from the viewers because I know you took this on very directly in your book. Wasn't there sort of a period the questioner says was there concern about a return to isolationism? But I agree with you that America was never isolationist. But wasn't there a window after World War II where we could have wound down our military and our military commitments as we did after World War One? And it's a big question of what prevented that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the United States did demobilize after World War II pretty rapidly. I spend a lot of time looking at this in the book. There's a pattern John Calhoun, when he was Secretary of War in the 19th century, called it an expansible army, that you have a very small permanent army. And then when you need a big army, when you're going to invade a neighbor like Mexico, or you're going to fend off the British, or you're going to teach the Spanish a lesson, or indeed keep the country intact in the 1860s in the Civil War, you then expand the army very rapidly, basically grow it to the size that it needs to be to do the task, and then afterwards you sort of shrink it again, you demobilize. And that started after World War II. The Army actually started planning for demobilization in 1943, which is remarkable because the United States was not exactly winning World War II in
Pre-D-Day.
1943. Yeah. Um, and then, and so, but it never expands, or sorry, it never contracts completely. And over time, from the 19th century until the early Cold War, there's a kind of slow ratcheting effect. So there would be, this rapid expansion, then a rapid contraction, but the contraction would never take it down to the previous level. So over time, the size of the military would increase gradually. So the demobilization that occurs after World War II still left the U.S. with a really big military. Then you have the Cold War set in. You have the National Security Act of 1947. You have the expansion of the military again. And that's why the Cold War kind of sets everything in place. It kind of crystallizes everything. The great counterfactual, which I actually don't answer in the book, is what if there was no Cold War? What if FDR was right and the USSR and the USA could get along, at least manage their differences, and there wasn't a Cold War? What would have happened? I still think there would have been something like an elastic or an elasticized conception of national security. It just would have taken a different form.
Yeah, and the other part of that counterfactual is what if there was no Korean War, which I think really kicked off the militarization, the intense increase in the size of the U.S. military. But Stephen, we have more questions that we're going to come back to. But Stephen, you've been very patient. And I think your book, which was published a couple of years ago, but is still a tremendous book to look back to, Tomorrow the World, really looks at the key decisions. I think it's a sort of hones in on that World War II period a little even more finely than Andrew's book does, and really looks at these key decisions to set up a doctrine not just of national security and engagement with the world, but sort of militarized uh, dominance in many ways. Um, and you also point to something I don't think Andrew emphasizes quite as much, but that there was a tradition of peaceful internationalism before World War II that was less militarized, that was less focused on U.S. primacy and more focused on U.S. cooperation in sort of uh, peaceful cooperation with the rest of the world. So, what's your view on this sort of evolution of national security?
First of all, it's just a tremendous book. I had an enormous amount of fun reading it, and I learned a lot. And I think for specialists who are steeped in this stuff, there's a lot to chew on in there. And for ordinary readers, also, it's just a luminously written book and a joy to read. So I just heartily recommend Andrew's book, and congrats on getting it into the world. So I think in many ways, our stories are very much running in parallel. Andrew's talking about the domestic roots of an international vision, national security. And I tried to tell a story with a quite similar timeline about how America's thoughts about the international uh, changed over time. And so, from my perspective, uh, the question I wanted to start with was you had a tradition of American statecraft prior to World War II that sought to avoid what Thomas Jefferson called entanglements, political military entanglements in the old world, at least beyond the Western Hemisphere. And then that tradition was uh, overcome in a decisive manner. And so what I found was that there was this whole tradition of internationalists who called themselves internationalists prior to the 1930s, and Woodrow Wilson is among them, but not the only one, who actually argued within that non-entanglement tradition. The Monroe Doctrine is an expression of that the United States will be a bastion of freedom in the Western Hemisphere, and doesn't need to go any further than that, either to provide for its security or to uphold its values. And over time, there come to be a set of people in the early 20th century that did value the creation of what we might call today a liberal world order. They became invested in that project. International law and arbitration was at the center of that project. Then the League of Nations was proposed by Woodrow Wilson. And even though the United States didn't join the League of Nations, a lot of Americans still participated in it and took an interest in it. And then that tradition, which we might call a tradition of collective security, is actually nationalized. So I'm making the opposite move on a spatial level from Andrew's. His story is about a domestic conception for FDR that's the New Deal and social security, the idea of providing insurance for citizens, reducing uncertainty, very important part of the book that stimulated a lot of thinking for me. And then it's broadened into national security. But at the same time, and that's all true, at the same time, there's a tradition of thinking about collective security, which FDR is a part of, that has to change in the late 30s and early 40s because of the failure of the League of Nations and collective security, as well as the shattering of British world power and the opportunity for the United States to emerge as the kind of unquestioned dominant player in global politics. And so for me, all those things come together in a really important 18-month period between the fall of France to Nazi Germany in the middle of 1940 and the attack on Pearl Harbor, which ultimately brings the United States directly into World War II. And so I think, if I'm to press on kind of one difference in our work, and a question, if I can maybe invent the concept of discussant's privilege that I'll pose to Andrew, I think we both agree that in the minds of American officials and intellectuals, the era of free security for the United States ended in the late 30s and early 40s. When the United States adopted an expansive global conception of its place in the world, expressed through the idiom of national security, as Andrew has it, or through the idiom of internationalism, now redefined against this new concept of isolationism and entailing the willingness to use or commit military force beyond the Western Hemisphere. So the question is, how do we judge what happened? Did this tradition of non-entanglement or free security die out because actual conditions of the world objectively made free security no longer viable, whether that's because of, military technology, global capitalism, etc. And so Americans realized that fact and reacted to more or less objective realities? Or is it because Americans retained a viable path forward to continue to enjoy free security, to continue to abide by the Monroe Doctrine limits on the projection of American political military power, but they chose to give it up for an option that they thought was better. And I'm in that latter camp myself. Despite all the warnings that Andrew reconstructs really well that were issued by figures in the late 30s, but particularly 1940 and 41, about how the American, what we call today the American homeland in North America, might possibly be invaded by the Axis powers if they were successful in their conquests in Europe and Asia. Then they could come over and gain a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Then they could come to North America. Yes, people made those claims, but a whole lot of people, major figures, I think including FDR, but certainly people like Walter Lippmann, freely admitted that that just wasn't going to happen, and the United States could still defend its own territory, even if the worst happened with respect to the wars in Europe and Asia. They nevertheless didn't want to live in the kind of world where the United States would be confined to a hemispheric existence and would have to be perpetually, in this view, on the defensive, as opposed to enjoying a U.S. style, if you will, liberal world order, where the United States would still have the freedom to trade, to do business, to participate in international arrangements beyond the hemisphere, and wouldn't have to be simply defending itself and the Western Hemisphere. So to me, I don't quite take seriously, maybe not seriously enough, but I don't quite take seriously the warnings about the U.S. eventually being invaded. I think I read those more as expressions of anxiety that the United States would lose the kind of world order that it preferred to see. And by the way, I think those concerns are completely reasonable in their own time. And I would not want to live in a world, needless to say, where the Axis powers would have won the war and the United States would have faced the situation we're describing. But I think what's so valuable about what Andrew's doing is taking a dispassionate look, where I'm sure Andrew feels exactly the same about World War II. Nevertheless, these debates set us up for problems that we're struggling with today. And so that's really my main concern in asking these kinds of questions. So basically, I'm wondering if Andrew has a view on whether, free security objectively became no longer viable for the United States, or whether it still was viable, but Americans, for other reasons, chose a more expansive path.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, for that thoughtful series of questions. I don't think there's a whole lot of daylight between us on this. And I also agree with you, no matter how, because you could read my book just as you could read your book, just as you could read some other books that are in this vein, like Sense of Power by John Thompson, a book I know that we both admire very much and was influential to us both. You could read those books and then you could draw the conclusion, because I try not to let my own views shine through in this. You could come to the conclusion that, wow, maybe actually Preston thinks that it was a mistake for people to issue those warnings about Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and I don't have that view. I'm glad that the United States and its allies won World War II. There were some mistakes made along the way, for sure. It's not a perfect, greatest generation, perfect war type, or rather good war type situation necessarily. But yeah, I'm with you. I'm glad that things worked out the way they did in that sense. I mean, the question about free security and whether the interventionists who you write about so well in 1940, 41, whether they believed the case they were making in that the Germans and Japanese could invade North America and could invade the continental United States is a really interesting one. I think your spidey senses are tingling for good reason. I think that a lot of them didn't actually believe that, and I think that FDR is one of those people, even though he warned several times that if the United States did nothing, it wouldn't just be a liberal world order that the U.S. would lose, but the U.S. might actually be physically attacked and physically invaded, and its system of government overthrown. There were some more candid, one might say honest, internationalists. You mentioned Walter Lippmann. I think of Henry Luce in his American Century article, where he says, even if we don't get involved and we let the Germans and Japanese conquer Europe and Asia, we're going to be fine if we want to be fine. But we shouldn't want to be fine like that. We should want to go and recreate this world order. So I think you're right. Those warnings were very frequent. They weren't just some, as you know, they weren't just some sporadic warnings here and there that we might get invaded, we might not get invaded. They're constant in 1939, 40, 41, especially as you get into 1941. I spend a lot of time in the book looking at Frank Capra, which I didn't expect when I started writing the book. Capra is actually a bigger figure in my book than Dean Acheson. So, I mean, if you read the book, I think that works. I mean, I really do think it works, and there's a reason why Capra is a bigger figure than someone like Dean Acheson. But he is a big figure because he, in his films, including his Why We Fight documentary series from World War II, which I spend a lot of time looking at, but also It's a Wonderful Life. He plays around with these ideas of America's place in the world and whether the U.S. can be attacked and can be invaded, and whether, Stephen, as you said, whether America's free security can come to an end. So the first chapter of my book is about the condition of free security, which scholars have mentioned, but as far as I know, I'm the first to give it this much treatment, or maybe not the first, but I'm definitely not the first. But I'm one.
Because I'm not sure people will know exactly what it refers to.
Right, exactly. So thanks, Marcus. So free security is it was first identified by C. Vann Woodward in 1960. He was an historian at Yale, and it was a condition where Americans could assume that they wouldn't be attacked, invaded, occupied, their system of government overthrown. Basically, they could take for granted that they were physically secure in the world. They had free security, and it was free in two senses. It was free in that Americans could assume that they wouldn't be attacked, and it was free in the sense that it allowed them to have a very small military, especially a small army, because they didn't have to worry about being invaded. And that, if it did exist, and not all scholars agree it existed, but I spend a lot of time and detail and research in the book trying to show that actually Americans did enjoy free security from the end of the War of 1812 up until, and we could pick our own dates as to when it ends, but it is sometime in the late night. It's probably in the 1940s, World War II period, maybe the early Cold War, something like that. It's a unique condition in international geopolitics. I can't think of another country that enjoyed free security in the last 200 or 300 years. And if you think about all of America's peer competitors over the last, let's say, 200 years, all the other great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, China, we'll toss in India, Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Russia. I mean, they were all, with the exception of Britain, which was attacked, of course, in both world wars. But with the exception of Britain, they were all invaded, and their system of government was either temporarily or permanently changed by the effect of outsiders doing that. And the Americans could assume that that wouldn't happen to them. In the early 20th century, the French ambassador to Washington, D.C., a man named Jules Jusserand, who was a very good friend of Teddy Roosevelt's, told Roosevelt that America was blessed among nations because to the north, you have a weak and friendly neighbor in Canada. To the south, you have a weak and friendly neighbor in Mexico. Neither of them, even if they wanted to do you harm, they can't. And to the east, you have fish. To the west, you have fish. So you Americans are blessed because you can just, go through the world and assume that you're going to be safe. And then you can devote a lot of your resources to economic development, to building up this colossus of an economy, and so on and so forth. Alexis de Tocqueville spotted the exact same thing decades earlier when he traveled America and then wrote Democracy in America. And he talks about this condition. He doesn't use the phrase free security, but he talks about that. And so free security. And now to get back to sort of finish the thought on Stephen's really interesting question, I think Stephen's right, or at least the sort of direction of his question. He's correct in that a lot of the interventionists in 1940, 41, and later, that they did not believe that America was going to be invaded. And in that sense, it still had free security. And people like George Marshall worried about public opinion that, okay, we're after the war is over, are we going to have what happened after World War I, where America's just going to walk away from Europe because everyone knows we're not going to be attacked and invaded? I think that a lot of those interventionists, even if they didn't believe that the Germans or the Japanese or later the Soviets were actually going to invade the United States or even do much in the Western Hemisphere, I think they still believed that free security was over because they believed that America's place in the world was tied to the existence, to the creation, and then the existence of a liberal world order that the United States would dominate. And that's what Stephen's book is. That's at the heart of Stephen's book. This idea of this new world order that then would be the basis on which the United States would prosper and be secure in the world. So at some point, it doesn't matter whether the US is going to be invaded or not, because American security, the boundaries of American security have been stretched so much. And that's what I write about, and that's what Stephen wrote about as well, that the whole basis, the whole fundamental basis of security is different for Americans of the 1940s conceptually than it was for Americans of the 1840s.
Yeah, there is an interesting quote in your book from a 1930s writer who's an anti-interventionist, who says there's no logical end to this elastic conception of national security short of the conquest of the whole world. And there's, to some degree, he had a point. And I think that some people might think, and Stephen might have been hinting at this, that we still have free security in a way. Certainly, if you look at our major rivals like China and Russia, we're in a super different position than them. I mean, they are directly surrounded by either enemies or countries that could be very powerful enemies, and we just don't have that situation. Um, so we've gotten a bunch of good questions here that I want to ask. One is, and I think this goes to uh, your point about collective security, Stephen, and kind of reviving that collective security tradition, because what happened post World War II is all these questions of collective global cooperation become very entangled in the U.S. in national security and even our military institutions. So there's one question here. National security as a concept has typically given geopolitical and military threats pride of place, but given how important transnational and domestic threats are, like global health, economic inequality, climate change, should national security start to prioritize these arguably more important challenges? And just in putting that question out, I think it's not so much that these challenges aren't important, they are important, but why is there an assumption that they would be part of this national security framework? But that's a move that's often made now. Stephen, Andrew, do you have thoughts on that?
Sure,
After
I
you.
could just, sure. I mean, I do agree that disease, climate change, and other challenges are important threats to Americans. Um, until the moment you asked your question, I've always kind of thought, well, that makes me more inclined to retain the concept of national security because I don't want us to overlook problems without passports that I think do genuinely threaten the United States. But when you asked your question, I started to think, are they properly framed as threats to American national security? Maybe you could say that they are threats to Americans, to the American people. They're not really threats against the territorial integrity of the United States. So there might be a way, conceptually, of squaring the circle and acknowledging the importance of transnational threats that also gets around the militarized conception of national security that Andrew writes about so well. Let me just, I want to just riff a little bit on one of the points Andrew made in his previous remarks. I think that what my reading of the book is that the key novelty of the invention of national security isn't so much that it facilitated the United States adopting a more global definition of its interests and therefore the circumstances under which it would use military force, though it did do that, so much as how national security made it difficult for Americans to distinguish between strictly self-defensive goals and larger goals that they wanted to pursue for other reasons. So, as Andrew points out in his chapters on American foreign policy prior to the Roosevelt turn in the 1930s, the United States was a very expansionist country before Americans were talking very much in terms of national security. We definitely found ways to expand our power, expand the very Union itself across North America, take colonies in the Caribbean and in the Pacific without resort to national security as the goal. But as Andrew suggests in his discussion of Woodrow Wilson in World War I, Americans were better able to distinguish between goals that spoke to the direct defense of the United States proper and objectives like spreading civilization that were quite different from that. And so maybe the ultimate significance of the adoption of this language of national security, it certainly enables a more militaristic U.S. posture in the world, but maybe the real significance is that it kind of corrupts our thinking and our debate about American foreign policy because it makes it very difficult for us to separate a claim that is really about helping other people or maintaining civilization, etc., defending world order, distinguish that from what is actually speaking directly to the self-defense of the United States.
I think that's exactly right, and that's probably a better way of putting it than I did in the book. I think that one of the themes that along those lines, Stephen, that I try and develop is that national security is about necessity. It's separate from the national interest or humanitarianism or even other forms of internationalism or one worldism or whatever things that might be really good and that a lot of Americans might agree with. But once you invoke national security, it's about protecting the country. It's about protecting the American people and not necessarily making the world a better place. And even if you could say there's a hidden realism behind making the world a better place because then it makes the world better for America, that's still different than we need to do this because if we don't, we're going to die or we're going to, and what FDR did as a means to an end to get Americans to agree to support going into World War II is, as you said, he conflates the two and he doesn't separate them. And so it's that doctrine of necessity, this isn't just a good idea. It's going to save lives. It's going to save our lives. That doctrine of necessity then makes it impossible to distinguish between all sorts of policies that actually might not be necessary if for Americans' own security, Americans' own protection, and then might lead the United States down into some foreign policy disasters. It could be in Vietnam, it could be Iraq, it could be other things that Americans have argued about. But once you invoke that national security justification, that's the difference I see between Wilson, who says we have to make the world safe for democracy, and then what's unstated is that's a good thing. But if we also make the world safe for democracy, we make the world safe for America because it's the biggest democracy, it's the biggest trading power, it's the biggest economic power. A world that's safe for democracy is in America's interest. But that's a more complex argument that kind of fades away after the war ends and Americans don't buy it anymore. That's a more complex argument than what FDR is saying. And as you implied earlier, and he's saying, kind of knowing it's not true, where he says, if we don't do this, then our system, I mean, he says on countless occasions, if we don't do this, if we don't resist the Nazis and Japanese, our whole system of government is going to come to an end. And they're going to be at our shores. And so on and so forth. So I think that's a really important point. Just if I could go back to the circle back to the question that Stephen answered already, and that Marcus asked us about transnational threats and climate change. I'd just say briefly that there is a theory of addressing those threats as security threats that has been called human security. And people like Mary Kaldor and Jessica Matthews and others in the late 80s into the 90s into the early 21st century developed a theory of human security that is very much about things like climate change. And these people, by the way, Jessica Matthews is writing about climate change in the late 80s in a way that feels, she could publish it right now and it would feel fresh. It would feel like she's speaking to the current moment. And so they developed this theory of human security that the UN very much adopts in the early 21st century, but that just kind of falls flat in the United States. And I think it's because it's never going to overcome this idea of national security, of protecting the nation and protecting Americans. And also because if you're going to address the problems of human security, which I think very, very much need addressing for everyone's good, you're going to need a level of international cooperation that is just it's too brittle, it's too fragile to the eruption of crises, and it will always take a back seat to national interests and to national security. So human security has never really caught on. I don't, I talk about this in my book. I'll admit, I don't really have a good answer for how we can get around that, how we can overcome that and come up with these transnational, international solutions to things like climate change, which we absolutely need to do. And I would finally just say that's not just an American problem. I mean, there are all sorts of countries in the world that are putting their own national interests first and foremost, and going off in different directions in tackling problems of global public health or climate change or what have you.
Yeah, what you said about the shield of necessity that is created by national security talk is so critical, and I think it's a critical political factor in DC when you're thinking about the use of national security rhetoric in DC because it's very concrete. First of all, courts will, including the Supreme Court, will defer to arguments about national security in a way that they won't defer to anything else. And national security also gets kind of a free pass from the political system in certain ways. I mean, people are very willing to put limitations, apply the Administrative Procedures Act, for instance, to rulemaking by agencies that do domestic policy, that just are issuing policies governing how we live with each other in America day to day, which are often like absolutely critical policies. But courts and Congress are very comfortable restricting their ability to do that, putting procedural uh, requirements in the way because they don't have that urgency or necessity. So if you can shelter your issue under national security, right, it gets the benefit of this. And we've actually seen this with domestic economic inequality. There's an argument we need to reindustrialize, we need to bring jobs back. Well, how is this always getting framed? It's always getting framed in terms of our combat or conflict with China. That if we don't do this, then the Chinese are going to beat us somehow. But of course, these are things we want to do for ourselves, and framing them in terms of World War III with China helps politically, but it's not necessarily really a good thing to do. And we have a ton of great questions here, which unfortunately we are not going to be able to get um, to all of them. But there is one that's kind of a good final question, I think. Um, and this person just asked, is there any such thing objectively as the national interest and national security, or is the language of national security just a discursive weapon that the political class uses to justify its preconceived ideas and policies? So that idea of a discursive weapon, I think, is quite powerful. And then another question that's related to it wasn't national security a misnomer in 1947 because the U.S. was moving into a world power, absorbing what we could from receding European imperialism. So basically, national security was just about empire building and American global predominance and the attempt to sort of step into that imperial framework.
Yeah, those are two big questions to end on. I'll try and be brief, which isn't always my forte, but just on the first question about is there any objective? I think the question was something like this: is basically, is there such a thing as an objective national interest or objective national security? And I would say there is not, short of, an invading army moving into your space and overthrowing your government, like the most extreme kind of violation of national sovereignty. Because if there was an objective national interest or an objective national security, then Americans wouldn't argue so much over pretty much everything in American diplomatic history has been politically contested and often really bitterly so. So, did Woodrow Wilson think the League of Nations was in the national interest? Of course he did, because, he created it and he wanted the US to join. But a lot of other people did not think that was in the national interest. Henry Cabot Lodge and other Republican senators who voted it down. Ronald Reagan, did he think it was in the national interest first to take a tough line against the Soviet Union and then to embrace Gorbachev and to embark on this extremely ambitious period of détente that led to the end of the Cold War? Reagan and others, like his Secretary of State George Shultz, thought that was in the American national interest. But Reagan's own Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, thought that wasn't in the national interest, and in fact, it was posing a risk to American national security. So, it's always politically contested, and whether it's discursively useful, absolutely, it can be. I think a lot of times, though, what's really interesting is when people genuinely believe, like in the case of, say, George Shultz against Caspar Weinberger. I think that's an argument that's born of conviction as well as expedience, and so. It definitely can be both. But thinking that there's some sort of pure national security or national interest out there that all it has to be done is just sort of discovered or identified, and then Americans won't argue about their foreign policy, just is not going to happen.
Even any final words along these lines?
I'll just say, I think that both my book and Andrew's reflects the fact that Americans really did change their minds about American foreign policy, about the role the United States should play. And there was a very serious movement to keep the United States out of the looming Second World War in the 1930s. FDR himself changes his mind enormously. So the idea that the US was just out to expand its power at all times and then would come up with rationalizations to do that, I think it's just not, doesn't bear out. You could have a sophisticated structural argument that said, well, people who wanted more US restraint were never going to win. Okay, we can have that argument. But at the end of the day, it's undeniable that, the senior most American policymakers and associated intellectuals, boy, did they change their minds very rapidly in the period that Andrew and I focus on. And, I think that's a conclusion to embrace, because it does mean that on some level, ideas and individuals matter, and therefore we can make different choices.
Yeah, well, I feel like we could go on for another hour here, especially about applying these concepts to this wild moment we're in here in Washington, D.C. right now. But this has been a great conversation, and I thank all the folks who stuck around for it. We had a bunch of great questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. But do check out Andrew Preston's new book, Total Defense. Like Stephen said, it's a very fun read through the whole of really these concepts in U.S. history. And Stephen's book, I think, is gonna last as really a classic about that key moment in our turn to global primacy in World War II. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.